Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Mary Ann Meskis, the Executive Director of the Dravet Syndrome Foundation. Got a few more people we're adding in. There we go. So we appreciate you making the time to join us today to learn more about the upcoming externally led patient-focused drug development meeting on Dravet syndrome. This is an exciting opportunity for us, and it's been organized by the Dravet Syndrome Foundation. Today's webinar will give you a little bit of information on what to expect in the meeting, as well as how you can participate and be a part of it. Can we have that next slide, James? And I did want to thank all of our sponsors: Encoded Therapeutics, Stoke Therapeutics, Zogenix, ASI, Jazz Pharmaceuticals, and Greenwich Biosciences, and Takeda. I think it's important to note, while we've been fortunate to have this sponsorship for this educational activity, all of the content that's being developed for the meeting is through the Dravet Syndrome Foundation, and statements are being made by our community, so this is really a patient-driven meeting. We have a few housekeeping things to go over. Today's webinar will last for approximately 1 hour. We would ask that all of our participants stay on mute, and then that way we can make sure that our presentations won't be interrupted. The webinar will be recorded and available for later viewing on our website, and we have the website listed there. You can also find it by going to our main website page under the Get Involved tab and then under Advocacy. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please use your Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. James Valentine and Larry Bauer are from Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, and I've gotten to know them over the past several months as they've been helping us plan this meeting. James has worked the last 13 years as a champion for the patient voice as part of the regulatory process. James previously worked at the FDA, where he was a patient liaison, helping to incorporate the patient voice into medical product review across the FDA's various medical product centers and review divisions. There, he helped to develop and launch the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative. Larry worked at the NIH for 17 years in clinical research, followed by a position at the FDA as a regulatory scientist in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's Rare Diseases Program, a group he co-founded and worked for 10 years, where he advanced rare disease drug development. In private practice, James and Larry have worked with many patient organizations to ensure their community's voices were heard by decision makers. Relevant to our EL-PFDD meeting, they've been involved in helping to plan and moderate 3/4 of the over 50 externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. So we're in good hands with James and Larry.
Thank you so much, Mary Ann. This is James Valentine, and you'll be hearing from my colleague, Larry Bauer, here shortly in the program. And we're excited to be here with this community to talk about this very important and great opportunity to have your voices heard as part of the drug development process and drug review process. And that is, of course, at this upcoming externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. Larry and I will be talking to you about what this meeting is, talking to you about how you can participate, and importantly, giving you some background information so you'll be more informed about what, where your voices will really make an impact. So just to cover some of the high-level overview before we get into some of the more specifics, this meeting, it's a really important opportunity to educate the Food and Drug Administration, which is, of course, the agency that oversees and regulates the conduct of research of new potential drugs and makes approval decisions for those drugs, which we'll talk about that process in more detail soon, as well as other stakeholders like drug developers, to help them understand what it is like to live with Dravet syndrome, how Dravet impacts your loved ones' lives, how you're currently trying to manage the syndrome, and what a meaningful new treatment might look like for your loved ones. This is all area where hopefully you can see that you are experts in, as this is what you are living with and experience in day-to-day life. but it really is important, as you'll learn through this webinar, for us to really have an in-depth understanding and hear from as many voices as possible. So you might be wondering, why should you participate? Well, this is really a unique opportunity to have your voices as caregivers heard directly by the FDA. As I was alluding to, FDA approves all treatments for Dravet syndrome. And so they need to know from you what is important for you and your loved ones. This knowledge will help them in their decision-making and ultimately lead to better treatment, potentially faster approvals of drugs for Dravet syndrome. You might also be wondering, why now? And this requires a little bit of historical context, that in the past, the patient's voice and you as caregivers representing that and bringing that has been absent from the drug development process. Usually it wasn't until a drug was approved by FDA, sometimes to treat something that might not really be important to patients, or once a clinical trial was failing and the drug company and FDA were putting their heads together to figure out why that might be, that a patient or a caregiver was consulted. And this was really too late in the process. And so FDA, along with the whole drug development ecosystem, realize that it's important to have your voices heard, not just at the end of the process, but at the beginning of the process and throughout. And this has really become a priority for FDA, and is what led back in 2012 to the initiation of the patient-focused drug development program. So we can learn from you all about what impacts patients most in their daily life, and understand from you what your greatest unmet medical needs are. So knowing at a high level that that's what we're focused on with an EL-PFDD meeting, for today's presentation, Larry and I are going to cover a few overarching buckets of information we think will be valuable to you as you consider whether you will want to participate, hopefully you will, but really prepare you for participating. I'm going to start with a little bit of background on FDA and drug development, so you know who your audience is and what it is that you're helping inform. After that, we're going to then give you an introduction to FDA's patient-focused drug development program and initiative. So then you can really understand where your voices fit into that process that I'll have talked about. And Larry will provide that overview, as well as giving you some more really practical information about participating in the meeting, on the covering things like the logistics, format, and tips for participating, and other important information you need to know. And as Mary Ann mentioned, you can submit questions in the chat box, and at the end of the presentation, we'll be answering any questions you might have. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about FDA and drug development at a high level. We wanted to talk about this process of how do drugs, actually, get discovered and move through development before they then eventually get reviewed and potentially approved, making it, so they're available to your doctors or other prescribers to be able to potentially prescribe these drugs for your loved one. Well, it actually all, before we even talk about clinical trials, we're really looking back to the beginning, which is the discovery of drugs. And here, this is where researchers are discovering new drugs by first and foremost learning more about the disease and the disease process, trying to find those opportunities where by learning more about how a disease might be able to be stopped or reversed, how we might be able to intervene with a potential drug. Once we have those potential targets, you can run tests on different compounds to find possible beneficial effects on any large number of diseases, but even with a specific disease in mind. Think of the zebrafish drug screens that have been done for Dravet syndrome. Existing treatments often have unanticipated effects, so we're not only screening to see if there's some new novel treatment, but maybe some existing treatment, things like repurposing of fenfluramine for Dravet syndrome to see if we might have a drug that is out there already might have possible beneficial effects in the specific disease. But while we are always happy to repurpose existing drugs, we are looking at new technologies, and often this comes from new scientific advances where we might now be able to target more specific sites within the body, or even manipulate genetic material And this might be in Dravet, we know that there might be genetic-based therapies as well as seizure detection devices to help with targeting new treatments. So once researchers identify a promising compound, they then can take that compound into development. And there's a well-established process that I'll talk about briefly to help make sure that these drugs are safe and effective when FDA ultimately approves them and they reach the public. The first set of testing, though, is done in what's called the preclinical stage. This is done before it's actually tested in humans. So when we think about the clinic and we say clinical trials, that means it's in humans, not necessarily just patients, but could be healthy volunteers. But in this preclinical stage, when we're doing testing, we're looking at whether the drug is reasonably safe to actually be used in humans and whether it's sufficiently effective against the disease target. And these tests can be in kind of the petri dish, so to speak, chemical assay tests. It can also be are done in animal models, and both to evaluate the potential efficacy as well as the toxicity in toxicology animal studies. Once we've done this preclinical research, the results of those investigations can then be provided to FDA in what's called an investigational new drug application, or IND. That IND submission is what allows us to move into clinical development, most typically phase 1. The IND contains those pharmacology and toxicology studies. Those are the preclinical studies of how the drug works and its safety. But it also includes information on the manufacturing information. So how is the products manufactured? What is the product made up of? How do we actually characterize the product to make sure that patients are getting something that is made uniformly and avoids having impurities that might be harmful? And then, of course, the IND also includes the clinical plan. This is the clinical protocols and the information that will be provided to the investigators, which are the doctors who are actually running the clinical trials. This allows FDA to evaluate the safety and efficacy for the specific proposed clinical trial. That proposed clinical trial is most likely going to be a phase 1 trial, the first type of study that we would conduct. Types of studies, they're short, they're small, they can be in healthy volunteers, but sometimes in patients. Or people with experience. We also will be, looking to see how the drug is metabolized and excreted. So, is the drug getting into the body in sufficient amounts? Is it getting to the areas of the body that we think it needs to get to in order to have an effect? We can look at that in these short-term studies in a few people. That will help us both evaluate the safety, but help us understand if we have a high enough dose or maybe too high of a dose. And we can select a dose to then carry forward into what are called phase 2 studies. When we move into phase 2, we are now for the first time really looking at understanding the drug's effectiveness. These are larger studies. They can be short, only a few or several months. They can be longer, in duration of a year or longer. But they're tend to be smaller because we're just trying to get an idea, proof of concept of whether the drug may provide a benefit. We want to see if the drug works in people who have a specific disease. So these studies are done in actual patients, with the actual patients who are the participants in this, rather than with healthy volunteers. We're often, but not always, comparing the drug against a placebo control. So that way we can really evaluate what drug benefits are due to the drug versus just being in a clinical trial, getting different care maybe than you normally would be, as well as helping monitoring the short-term side effects and other safety issues. You'll see that safety is an ever-present thing that we're measuring in studies. Here, this is a larger study than in phase 1. It'll be longer. So it gives us a chance to see things that maybe take a little longer to develop from a safety perspective. And whenever we increase the number of people receiving a product, we're going to see some more of the rarer side effects, things that maybe not everybody experiences. So we'll get to understand that and start to build an understanding of treatment benefits and treatment risks. But it really isn't until phase 3 that we're fully kind of evaluating the drug's effect, the treatment benefit. And so phase 3 studies are what you probably hear the most about in terms of traditional large-scale randomized placebo-controlled trials. This means, these are the largest studies we conduct, and they're the longest studies. We want to make sure here that there actually have enough people and run for a long enough time to see a treatment benefit and be able to see one that we can compare to our control group. Again, most commonly through a use of a placebo control. Here, I mentioned we are focused on effectiveness, but because these studies tend to be longer, we can actually not only see what the effect is, but how durable and long the effect lasts. And because these studies are larger, we can actually see the effect in different subpopulations, maybe different age groups, male versus female, different disease subpopulations, different patients with different severity when they came into the trial. We can evaluate all of those things because we have more people. So we'll actually have enough people within each of those smaller populations to at least, be able to, eyeball the differences. And throughout development, we may still be looking at varying dosages of the drug, including in phase 3. As I alluded to, safety will always be on the table. We're still looking at safety in these phase 3 studies. And just as with phase 2, since these are even larger and typically longer, they will also be able to pick up on more of the different safety issues that might occur from taking the drug. It also gives us a chance to evaluate in phase 3 potential drug-drug interactions because we're having a larger, less controlled group of people than we have in, say, phase 1 or phase 2. Many of the people in the study may be on other drugs that are commonly used in your patient population. And we know in Dravet, there's a whole constellation of different therapies that your loved ones are taking. And so we are able to also evaluate whether there's any interactions with those, although if there's suspected to be interactions, a lot of that is going to be evaluated in animal studies and the like before a patient would ever be put at risk. So once clinical development concludes, and one thing I should mention is, drug development, particularly in rare diseases like Dravet, doesn't always follow that simple linear fashion of, phase 1, pause, phase 2, pause, phase 3, and usually, FDA's default is having 2 phase 3 studies. But in rare diseases, a lot of the time, those phases are collapsed together, phase 1 and 2 or phase 2 and 3 done in a single study. And a lot of the times in rare diseases, a single phase 3 study can suffice if it's designed a certain way and has, robust enough results. So once all of that clinical data is collected, FDA then, a company requests, and FDA will hold a pre-NDA meeting with the company that's developing the drug. They will provide a summary of all of the information as well as the results from their phase 3 studies to the FDA, identifying which of those are the pivotal studies, so the ones that they're intending to be the studies establishing the drug's benefit. They're going to discuss the methods of statistical analysis that were done when presenting those results. And ultimately, the goal here is to see if there's any major unresolved issues. And this could be in the clinical data. So this may be, a lot of the times, and you may have seen this in rare disease drug development, that, because we have smaller numbers of people that we're studying, it's sometimes we don't have the power or the size of a study needed to detect some of the smallest changes. And a small change may still be important for a patient. And so, there may be questions of how robust or meaningful the results are. And FDA may want to see another study to help really give them confidence that a drug effect is real or is meaningful. But there might be other issues with the manufacturing of the product. Certainly can be an issue, or maybe there's been safety signals that have been picked up that need to be resolved or further investigated. But that's all talked about before a company would then submit what's called its new drug application, or for a biological product like a gene therapy, a biologics license application, a BLA, which is the application to allow the company to put that drug on the market. And so once that meeting is held and the company has a green light to submit their NDA or BLA, the company will put all of that information together, everything from those preclinical studies through all of those clinical trials and all of their manufacturing information, and submit that to the FDA. FDA then, the clock, they're on the clock. They have to first review that application to ensure it's complete. And if they agree that it's complete, they will then file the NDA or BLA. When they do so, they will assign a review team. During review, FDA assesses whether the effectiveness has been demonstrated for the drug's proposed use, for the specific patient population that the company is seeking approval. They will also evaluate the safety of the drug in order to conclude that it's, again, safe and that the drug's benefits outweigh those risks. So no drug itself comes without some risks, some side effects, and some have more than others. But ultimately, there's no specific bar for how much or little risks are needed to have a drug approved. It's relative to the benefit that the drug provides. And that's why, for example, in oncology, you see that there are very toxic drugs that come with a lot of risk because the benefits, the potential life-saving benefits, outweigh the risks of those drugs. But as you'll hear later, that's important that not every patient population has the same risk tolerance. And that's why it's important to hear from you all to understand what your risk tolerance is. FDA also assesses the manufacturing methods and controls to, again, continue to make sure that the product is of high quality. It doesn't matter if a drug is safe and effective if it's not manufactured in a way that will provide the drug, in a way where you actually know what you're getting each time, and it's not going to include impurities that might be harmful. One important thing to note is you may have heard of advisory committees, these meetings that FDA convenes with external experts and the public to get input to help them answer questions about the approvability of a drug. This happens while FDA is on the clock. So FDA chooses whether they need an advisory committee to help them answer key questions. And if so, we'll schedule one for while it's reviewing. Ultimately, the advisory committee's input is just advisory. And so regardless of whether the advisory committee kind of votes positively in favor of the drug or negatively, against, recommending against approval of the drug, FDA can still make its own decision regardless of that vote. I do want to mention that even once a drug is approved, FDA's job and the company's job is not done. There continues to be surveillance of the safety of the drug once the drug is on the market. And this is important because clinical trials, by necessity, are in a smaller group of people, and you have inclusion-exclusion criteria that limit who participates. Yet, when the drug gets approved, it's out on the market, and there's going to be a much broader range of people taking it, people that may not have qualified for those clinical trials, and in much larger numbers. And remember, that means we'll be able to detect even more rare side effects. And so this information, as it is noticed, is reported, and FDA then can make decisions of whether the safety information needs to be updated in the approved product's labeling, or maybe if do the benefits still outweigh the risk, or maybe should the drug be pulled off the market because there's too much of a new safety issue that's been detected. So that evaluation is kind of done on an ongoing basis, even once a drug is approved. So we talked about the process of how drugs are developed. Let's talk about FDA's role in that. So in terms of drug development and those clinical trials, FDA is not the one that's actually developing the drugs. That's researchers, pharmaceutical companies, even in some cases, nonprofit groups are conducting the disease research and the drug development research. FDA is not the one that's actually testing drugs in those clinical trials. They're not running trials. Their staff aren't on site during clinical trials. It's the researchers and drug developers that are conducting them and have to seek FDA approval before they initiate those trials. I also want to mention that FDA does not have the authority to regulate the practice of medicine. So when your doctors are providing you care, or your loved one's care, are making decisions about whether or not to prescribe a drug, that's not what FDA regulates. They only regulate the companies that are marketing the drugs, the manufacturers. So they're regulating the development and marketing, but then when it comes to the doctor and what they can do, they're free to prescribe FDA-approved drugs for other conditions. So you may know this term, it's called off-label use. And so, doctors, they get to use their medical judgment and base their decisions off of scientific research, but that might be research that's published and not necessarily information that FDA is evaluated. So FDA does not regulate that. And so even drugs maybe that aren't, as you all would know, that aren't specifically approved for Dravet are used in Dravet, again, because that is what doctors can do within their practice of medicine. FDA also does not regulate the price of medicine or whether insurance will cover a medicine. That is actually not at all part of their mandate. Even if they had that information, they wouldn't be able to take that into account when they're making their approval decision, but they don't receive that. They actually have no idea what the drug pricing will be. They're evaluating the drug's direct benefits to patients against the safety issues or risks to patients. While I've now said a lot about what FDA doesn't do, I do want to mention that FDA does have a role in helping facilitate drug development. Part of their mission is to help not just protect the public health, but actually promote the public health. And as you can imagine, FDA reviewers, they're reviewing and seeing the results and how of every different drug clinical trial that's being conducted. They know the pitfalls, they know best practices for designing studies. And so they're there, to help provide that technical help to researchers and drug developers. And those researchers and drug developers can request meetings, submit protocols to FDA to help design clinical trials. And in fact, they do very commonly have numerous meetings between FDA and companies throughout that drug development process that I outlined. So I covered that drug development process very quickly and at a high level. There are different resources out there for you to learn more. One resource is on the FDA webpage. They do have some more information on how FDA regulates medical products. And so if you're interested in that, you can go to the FDA website listed on this slide and check that out. But without further ado, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Larry Bauer, who's now going to tell you where your voice fits into that process.
Thank you so much, James. That was a great overview of drug development and, trying to, help folks understand the different phases that are involved in bringing a new drug to market. Next slide. So once again, just to go back to now, we're going to be having this meeting, and just to review the purpose again, that FDA wanted a more systematic way to gather the patient perspective about the condition and available treatment options as a drug was being developed and reviewed. And this information helps inform their understanding of the context for benefits and risks, which they assess, which feeds into their decision-making for new drugs, as whether or not to approve them or not. And patient input helps the FDA during drug development and their review of the application for marketing a new drug. Next slide. So we've mentioned several times this term benefit risk assessment. So the FDA has a very standard way of analyzing what are the potential benefits of a new drug. So how could it help people with Dravet syndrome if it was for that condition? And then what are the possible risks or side effects? So to do this, they have to analyze the condition. They have to understand, like, what is Dravet syndrome? What are the symptoms of Dravet syndrome? What affects people most, people living with Dravet syndrome? And then they also have to understand what's available to people currently. Are there a lot of drugs available? How effective are those drugs? Are there maybe other treatments besides drugs? And then, so they look at those things to help establish the context. And then to help understand the benefits and risks, they have to review the research studies, the clinical research studies that you all might participate in, where they have data that shows what are the potential benefits, and then what were the side effects that were seen in a clinical trial. And then were there ways to possibly manage those side effects? So if there is a side effect, is there possibly a way to treat it so it's not so bad? Next slide. So for this Dravet syndrome externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, we have a framework for discussing certain questions. And these questions came from the FDA's benefit risk framework that we just went over, and they represent important considerations that the FDA is going to look at in their decision-making with new products. We reviewed this and other disease area questions and tailored our agenda and panel questions to communicate the most important information related to Dravet syndrome. FDA has emphasized to us that active patient involvement and participation is going to be the key to the success of these meetings. So this meeting is only going to happen with all of you. And then you say, what's the outcome of the meeting? So we will have, many people from the FDA in attendance on the day of the meeting, but at the end of the day, we will generate something called the Voice of the Patient report. This will be a written summary of the meeting. It will summarize the caregiver and audience testimony, the polling data we'll collect, and any submitted written comments. This document is a key communication to FDA review staff and regulated industry about what patients and caregivers most want to see in a new treatment. And we just want to emphasize, James mentioned this earlier, FDA really wants this information. It informs them about ways to develop meaningful treatments for Dravet syndrome. Next slide. So now just a little nitty-gritty about how to participate in the meeting. So who is the meeting for? Primarily for Dravet syndrome patients and caregivers, FDA staff, as well as pharma and biotech companies. These might be companies already developing something or companies that are interested, but it's really open to anyone interested in learning. We would like you to invite your family, your friends, physicians, anyone who might be interested in learning about Dravet syndrome to participate in the meeting. The meeting takes place on February 3rd this year from 10 a.m. to 3:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's a virtual meeting, so you can log in from anywhere in the United States, or we actually had, for many of these meetings recently, people from all over the world. And it's an interactive live stream meeting. Next slide. So just to give you an overview of what the day is going to look like on February 3rd, first, there'll be a welcome and some introductory comments from the meeting co-moderator, as well as from a representative from the Food and Drug Administration. Then we have Dr. Sullivan will be giving us a background on Dravet syndrome with talking about what the symptoms from a scientific perspective, as well as some of the current clinical trials and drugs in development that exists. And then once we have kind of those foundational talks, we're going to move into what I always consider like the meat of the meeting. So there are two main topics. The first one is, how does Dravet syndrome and the symptoms of Dravet affect your life, you or your loved one's life? And secondly, how do you manage symptoms, and what are current and future approaches to treatment? So current ones that you might have tried or are using, and then possible future approaches that you would like to see. Some of the topics include pre-recorded patient and caregiver testimonies. So we have a panel of 5 people for the morning and 5 people for the afternoon that will have pre-recorded 5-minute statements. Then we also have audience polling, is followed by a moderated discussion with the audience. And then the meeting will end with a summary of the day and some closing remarks. Next slide. So what are we going to ask you? What kind of things will we ask you to call in about on the day of the meeting? So the first topic is going to be, like I said earlier, living with Dravet syndrome. What are the symptoms and impacts? Some of the things to consider of all the symptoms of Dravet syndrome, which 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on your loved one's life? We want to know, how does Dravet syndrome affect your loved one on the best days and worst days? And then to ask you to describe your best days and your worst days. And we'd like to know, are there specific activities that are important that your loved one cannot do at all or as fully as you would like because of Dravet syndrome? Next one. And then we'll continue with symptoms. How have your loved one's symptoms changed over time? And how has your loved one's ability to cope with symptoms changed over time? So, how did it look when you were first diagnosed or first had onset of symptoms versus where you're at now? And then what kind of things do you fear the most as your loved one gets older? What worries you the most about their condition? And what frustrates you the most about their condition? Next slide. Then in the afternoon, we're going to shift gears. We're going to focus more on treatments. What are some of the challenges to treating Dravet syndrome? So the questions that we're going to ask you to call in on are like, what are you currently doing to manage Dravet syndrome symptoms? And how well do these treatments treat the most significant symptoms of Dravet syndrome? This will include both medical treatments, things that have been prescribed by your physician, as well as other things like certain dietary changes. We've heard that some people do hippotherapy or, with horses. We'd like to hear everything that you're doing to try to help. And then what are the most significant downsides to your current treatments and how do they affect your loved one's daily life? And finally, short of a complete cure, which we know everybody is looking for, what specific things would you look for in an ideal new treatment for Dravet syndrome? Next slide. So the discussion format, there will be, as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a group of caregivers for each of the panel. There's 5 for each panel, and the purpose for their pre-recorded statements is to set the foundation for the broader audience discussion. These panelists are a group of people that were selected to reflect a range of experiences with Dravet syndrome. Then, after we listen to their pre-recorded statements, people in the audience and online are going to have a chance to answer polling questions. The purpose for these is a starting off point for discussion. You'll use your cell phone, tablet, or laptop. There will be instructions on the top of your screen how to join the polling participation. It's very simple. And we'll be able to see the results of the polling questions in real time. So we'll be seeing what's coming in from everybody that's participating. And then finally, there's a discussion with the caregivers in the audience. And the purpose of this is to build on the experiences shared by the panel. And our moderator, who's going to be James, he will ask questions and then invite you to submit responses either in writing or preferably, we'd like as many people as possible to call in live on the day of the meeting to provide their comments. Next slide. So a few tips for how to participate effectively in the meeting. We'd like you to remember FDA's role and the purpose of the meeting. These were some of the things James went over. Maybe review the discussion questions in advance. And if you have something important to share, relate it to the most appropriate topic or panel question that was just asked, and then call in. Like, once again, the phone number to dial in will be on the top of your screen. It's a very simple process. It's okay to reiterate a feeling or experience that somebody else has already voiced. It might be similar to your own, but give it a personal or unique perspective. And try and keep your comments concise and focused. There's many voices to be heard about this very emotional topic. And you can always send in additional comments after the meeting is over by, we'll give you a website where you can submit additional comments. Next slide. So participating in the discussion, you will participate by webcast. This is, everybody's going to be remote because of COVID. You'll be able to participate in the polling questions and then to call in with comments and write comments in as well. Responses will be kept confidential. We might just use your first name and where you're calling from. This is some information about where to register for the meeting. You might want to jot down this URL. It's basically /Dravet-L-PFDD.org/. And comments with answers to the questions, like I said, they can be submitted for 30 days after the meeting. And all of this information that we're collecting, the polling data, your call-in comments, your written comments, all of this input is going to be combined and put eventually into this voice of the patient report, which will try to paint a picture of what it is like to live with Dravet syndrome. Next slide. So in summary, this is your opportunity to be part of the process. You can have a meaningful impact on clinical trial design and drug development. Your collective voices must be heard at the beginning of the process to try to help companies design trials that meet your needs and to help FDA as they assess risks and benefits with the full understanding of the impact of Dravet syndrome and the patient perspective. Please join us on February 3rd. This meeting won't happen without you. And this is an incredible way that you can make a difference. Next slide. So we have time, I think, for some questions, a little Q&A. For now, we ask that you put your questions into the chat box. If you have a question that comes up afterwards, I think many of you, most of you, maybe all of you know Veronica. Please email Veronica at veronica@dravetfoundation.org, and she can continue to help with questions. So with that, I don't know, James, have you had a chance to look at questions in the chat? Is there anything?
I did, and I'll be inviting Marianne and Veronica to help in answering questions, as well as the two of us. So I'm going to just work through the questions as they've come in the chat. There's been a number that have come in, and we're always happy if we can't give as much. There's some really good questions about drug development. We'll give a high-level response. If there's more that you'd like to learn, just email Veronica, and we can always follow up with you individually with more information. But the first question that we received was about participation, and are all Dravet caregivers encouraged and invited to attend the meeting? And this answer is overwhelmingly yes. All Dravet caregivers are encouraged and invited to attend. So so if you're on this webinar and you're planning to attend, and maybe you're a parent or an aunt or an uncle, a grandparent, a sibling, we want to hear from you. You have a perspective of your loved one and what it is that they live with in their lives. And so we would encourage you to participate, as well as for you to invite other family members that caregive and live with and have insights into what it is to live with Dravet. Marianne or Veronica, anything you want to add to that?
I think the only thing I would add is to remember that if you have a friend or a family member who you feel like maybe doesn't fully get Dravet syndrome or what your life looks like, this is going to be a really powerful meeting where they're going to really get to hear more about what daily life with Dravet syndrome actually looks like. And so certainly you can invite them to watch or rewatch this as well. The more that tune in, the better, the more powerful it will be.
Absolutely. And once this is recorded, even if they can't make the live meeting, this recording will be available for you to share with your network. So the next question is, can you share about the FDA Fast Track for approval? So the high-level answer to this is that Fast Track is a program that FDA has to give more attention to drugs that treat serious conditions where there's an unmet medical need that the product helps address. And so when a product is designated as Fast Track, there's also others called breakthrough therapy, regenerative medicine, a number of these different programs. the general idea is that companies have more opportunities to interact with FDA throughout that development timeline to help, make sure that they're getting more of that expertise from the agency, which is geared towards hopefully designing the most efficient development program possible. Now, your voices are important for that because FDA needs to know what those serious symptoms and health effects of Dravet are, particularly given that there are available therapies for Dravet. They need to know that, what it is that drugs could address that would still be helping, what is your unmet medical need? And that will actually help FDA in granting these types of designations to products and give more attention to products for Dravet. So great question.
And yeah, I just want to add to that, there's another process called priority review, that if we can show the FDA that this new drug is really important and is going to be a breakthrough, and is that patients need it as soon as possible. The usual drug review time is 10 months for the FDA, but if they get something called priority review, that 4 months are taken off of that, and the drug review time period goes down to 6 months. So that drug becomes available to you 4 months earlier than it would. So that's another reason that this meeting that we're having is important, to help show that and demonstrate it to the FDA.
So the next question is, would love to know what are the requirements to do only one phase 3 trial? I had mentioned that in rare diseases, sometimes one study can be enough. What I'll just mention now, and Tyler, maybe we can send you something as follow-up, is that the authority for FDA to do this is actually in the law. The statute itself, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, gives FDA the authority to approve off of a single study. And FDA has a number of guidance documents that go into some of what are the characteristics or requirements for actually being able to use that. And, the big criteria are that, it's a serious disease with an unmet medical need and is or is rare. So, Dravet hits all 3 of those, especially once FDA hears from you all. But there's some other factors too that are more scientific. And again, we can happy to share those documents as follow-up. We have another question. My guess is most of these were coming in while I was presenting. The question is the NDA, that's that new drug application, accessible to the general public to peruse it at a later stage? So no, the NDA itself is not made public, but FDA does publish its review documents. So you can go, and the database is called Drugs at FDA, but you can go into that database and see what were the data, what did FDA consider, and ultimately what was the basis for that approval. If a drug ultimately is not approved, unfortunately, those documents are not made public. So it's only for approved drugs. Kind of a similar question about transparency. Someone asked, how does the FDA require drug companies to release public information about trials? Many of you may be familiar with a website called clinicaltrials.gov. This is the government data bank of clinical trials. And so companies that are conducting primarily phase 2 or phase 3 studies are required to register those studies. And then after a certain amount of time are required to submit the results of those studies to clinicaltrials.gov. Companies can delay submitting results until after the drug is approved with some caveats. So there is eventually a requirement that phase 2 or phase 3 studies will have results on clinicaltrials.gov. So that's another place outside of the FDA review documents where you can find those results in addition to any other presentations or sharing that the company might do outside of actual requirements, like in publications. There's a question of where does an individual IND fall into the drug trial process? So I think what this is referring to is a individual expanded access IND. So sometimes when drugs are being developed, there may be particular patients or parts of the patient population where it is appropriate to provide them with treatment access to an investigational drug. There's certain regulatory requirements that need to be met. One important one being that it doesn't interfere with the conduct of clinical trials, because the best way to get the most people access to safe and effective drugs is when they're approved and available on the market. But where expanded access is appropriate, then that can be allowed. That individual expanded access does not really fit into the drug trial process. Sometimes that information can be informative, but that access is not designed rigorously like a clinical trial, because the goal is treatment, not research. So it doesn't really have a formal place in helping establish the safety and efficacy of a drug. Just keeping going here. This question, are disease-modifying therapies given preference during the approval process versus something that's more symptomatic? So this question is saying, if a drug really addresses the root cause of the disease, maybe like a gene therapy or some other really targeted therapy, is that given more preference over something that might relieve symptoms but not address the underlying disease? And the answer is no. FDA reviews both. If the requirements for the NDA to be filed are met, FDA reviews those the exact same way. Now, if a treatment provides some important benefit addressing some unmet need, like Larry talked about, a priority review can be given, but even a symptomatic treatment can be given priority review. So it's really just the actual, weight of the evidence that impacts the degree of priority it's given. There's a question, why are drug nutrient interactions not considered during trials? They vary. The answer is they very well may be. Every time a clinical trial is proposed, FDA considers the specifics of that population, including standard of care outside of drug treatments. And so while it's not as prominent as drug-drug interactions, that could be something that FDA would be worried about if there was a reason to be, if this was brought to their attention as part of that, or if they noticed, for example, that patients had a certain nutrient standard of care that is known to potentially have drug interactions. One of the best questions, will we be sending a link to this PowerPoint recording? The answer is that this recording will be posted on the PFDD website that we gave a few times during this presentation. So you'll be able to go and access that recording. And we do encourage you to share that with others that might be attending the meeting. So thank you. Next question, although I might have Larry take over some answering, I'll take a drink of water, is what are the obstacles of having our adult population included in the clinical trial phase of new drug development? Actually, this may be better for Marianne or Veronica. And is there any way that this can be influenced during this interface?
Yeah, so, right, I could see how this could be a problem. I wasn't aware of this. Since the new onset of the disease tends to be earlier in infancy, that I could see how maybe people, as they get older, that they might be excluded from a trial. I think one of the things to do is in drug development, once again, we're to get the patient voice included, is to meet with drug companies. Any drug company developing a new product is going to want to meet with you. You are going to be able to give background to them to help review maybe study design, to say this is what works for our community, this would never work for our community. And another thing is, one of the trade-offs that you have is that you can say that that as an organization that you would be able to help with recruitment, and recruitment is a critical aspect of running a clinical trial. If you can't recruit patients, you don't have a study. The drug company can't do the study. And so I would encourage you to have, interactions with drug companies early to start talking about these things. And as I'm thinking about, including older kids, one possibility would be to design a trial that might have a separate arm of the trial that was for older people, over a certain age that wasn't the primary analysis of the trial, but that would be like a secondary analysis that might contribute. And that secondary analysis, secondary trial in older people, it might show that there's efficacy, or if it didn't show efficacy in, older folks, it wouldn't detract from, from the other trial. So that would be one possible way to get around that. But I think it's important to have discussions about this topic with drug companies. Marianne, have you experienced this, or?
I think certainly our biggest challenge has been making sure that we can identify the adult population and let people, let them know that there are certain centers, for instance, that would host enough patients that they could possibly recruit for trial. So it's something we've struggled with, certainly as a rare epilepsy, and we have been trying to work on, but we still have some challenges.
Yeah, and actually, we just kind of reviewed Dr. Sullivan's presentation, and he showed some actual data about that as people with epilepsy are diagnosed older and older, that Dravet, the diagnosis of Dravet syndrome, often does not happen as frequently, even though they might have Dravet syndrome. So I can see how there's challenges in even just identifying who those people are.
I will say one thing is, drug developers and FDA will be on this meeting, this externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. It is important that we hear from the broad Dravet community and not only the caregivers of those younger patients, and so I think this extends not only to the broader age, but other, broad aspects of this community, those who maybe, have a somewhat more mild presentation. This isn't, we're not just, don't think of this as, we only want to hear from those who maybe, as you all know each other, have a relatively more severe, condition. We actually want to hear from everybody because, what you experience or your loved one experiences, whether it's an older patient or whether it's someone who maybe has a little bit less severe of symptoms or health effects, it's still an extremely serious condition, and FDA needs to hear about the range of experiences, and they're all serious and they all are unmet needs that need to be addressed. And if we hear from all of you, representing the broad, Dravet community, that kind of creates and elevates the need for trials, and treatments, not just within one part of the community, but the whole community. So that's actually a very good starting point, is to, if you're the caregiver of an adult patient or an older child, or maybe someone at some of the past Dravet Syndrome Foundation meetings, you say, oh, my loved one has it better or has it easier than some of the other people. Well, we still very much need and want to hear from you, because that's going to help paint the fullest picture and make sure that your loved ones, don't get left out of the picture. We need to be aware of them and their experiences.
James, I would just add to that, this is a really unique and important opportunity for our patient community. We always talk within our community about how we want better treatments, and we want not just for seizure control, but for all of these other issues that our children and adults deal with daily. So sleep, behavior. This is that chance to really have almost a direct line to the FDA via this voice of the patient report, so they have a full understanding of what our disease state is. So I really implore everyone to participate. If for some reason you can't join us live, please be sure to submit a comment in advance that will be included, or follow up and watch the live stream after the fact and add your comments. We just really need your participation.
So that's it for the questions that we have. And it looks like we're right up at the top of the hour. So I'll hand it back to Marianne.
Great. Thank you all again for joining today. If you have any questions, certainly you can reach out to Veronica or to myself. If you're looking for the page on our website with information on the meeting, James had given the SMART URL earlier, but you can also find it by going to the Get Involved tab and then Advocacy, and then you'll see the link to the EL-PFDD page. And we really hope that all of you will be able to join us. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you all.